Welcome to my presentation about game-based learning and education more than a game. So just to start, I want to talk about what game-based learning is and where it came from. So game-based learning is a form of incorporating game elements or games into a learning environment. And the reason that we do this, that it was done, is for one simple reason, and that is motivation. But like people like games, people like sports. If we incorporate that in, perhaps they'll be more engaged in learning and they'll learn better because of that. Here's a graph of the most watched events in the US in 2021, and you can see just how many of them are sporting events, from the Olympics to basketball to football, mainly football. But so because of that, they're like, if we incorporate games in, then perhaps learning will increase. So basically, there are two forms of game-based learning. Number one is just incorporating basic game elements into your teaching. So incorporating competition and just reviews, like having points, having things, but it's still just basic learning. And the second way is having an actual video game immersive experience. Um, so just to talk about the start, it started with Pac-Man, as you can see. I kid, it did not start with Pac-Man, but around this time was when the first idea of game-based learning came about. Basically, ever since there have been games, people have thought, well, maybe games would help learning because I noticed how much Pac-Man teaches kids, and how much they enjoy playing it. The prominent most, so because of that, there's not really a founder because it's just kind of naturally evolved. But the two most prominent researchers are Bruce D. Homer, pictured here, and Jan L. Ploss, sorry, pictured here. They're both professors of education. Dr. Homer at the City University of New York and Dr. Ploss at New York University. And then I also want to draw attention to Mabel Addis because she created the first like school learning video game. And this is an example that we see here. This is actually the video game. It was called Sumaria. And basically, her students on a computer in the 1960s were in charge of a city in Babylon, and they could make decisions about what to plant, where to go, how to spend their resources. And then they would have events happen like floods, rats, sicknesses, attacks, and they would have to deal with it. And you could see how well you're doing based on like population, how satisfied your population was, if they were happy or unhappy. And so that was really impressive in the 1960s, but this is one idea of how a game could work is having like a video game. So you can see here this is also an immersive video game. Your goal isn't necessarily to learn, but you're in this video game, you're interacting, you're doing things. Obviously on the right, you can see there are fractions and you want to, I mean, sorry, not fractions. There's addition and you want to do the addition correctly to be able to get points and move on, but you're really just playing a game with math thrown in there. On the other hand, we have just gamification. So here's an example here that I used. This is Kahoot. It's just a math question. You answer the math question, you get points, and there's a leaderboard. I was the only one who joined this one, so obviously there's no one else. But it shows the scores, and you can see how well people are doing, and there's that competition. But really, you're just answering math questions, and there's no like additional gamification going on. You're answering math questions with that. There's also another thing, like just what I've done too, is adding in Pictionary. So you do a math problem, and then you come to the board and do Pictionary. And so if you do the math problem later, you can still win because you can solve the Pictionary first, and it's a competition in that way. But neither of those is like an immersive game. Those are just game elements added on to it. So a couple of, or I guess three studies that I wanted to talk about in my research of game-based learning. This is like a typical study of game-based learning. The other two that I'll talk about are meta-analyses. So this one was called Beyond Play, the interplay of analogy and enjoyment in game-based learning. So these researchers, sorry, do not know how to say their names, have brought in a group of 54 students. Well, I guess I had two classes, one of 24 students, one of 30 students, and they were learning about biomagnification, bioaccumulation, which is basically how toxins accumulate in larger animals. Because small animals have a little bit of toxin, but then you eat a lot of small animals and you have a lot of toxin, and you basically how that's bad for the environment and bad for the food system. Anyway, so they played a game called Toxic Chain, where you were an animal and you had to eat and you got eaten, things like that, to discuss these concepts. And one group discussed the analogy after, and for example, they were like, okay, so you know how in the game, when you could choose to eat this kind of food that is like this in the actual world, and how nuclear like waste actually gets into animals, or how it may be. And the other group just like basically played the game and got tested. There was an increase in learning across both groups. There was a little bit of an increase after the discussion, but really or it wasn't anywhere close to as big as the difference in learning across both groups in the study. Um, the next one, as I said, this was a meta study, so effects of digital game-based learning in STEM education on students' motivation and systematic literature. So review. They started, they looked at 446 studies, cut it down to 28 studies, and basically looked at motivation. And most of the studies measured motivation through a series of surveys asking, I enjoyed playing this game, I wanted to play this game. And you would rate yourself on 1 to 7 or 1 to 10, how much that was true for you, and then you would add up the scores and get a value. And in 75% of the studies, found that motivation did increase based on motivation was increased by playing these games. And these were digital games. So you can see here that's Minecraft. There's Minecraft for Education. It was like immersive games, not just adding gamification elements in. So in modification, 75% of the studies found an increase, and 25% either didn't find anything or didn't find an increase. They also found specifically that prior knowledge of the concept helps. So if we're learning math, if we're learning about linear equations, knowing what linear equations are, that helped a lot. Prior game knowledge also helped, but not as much. So knowing like Minecraft for Education, having played Minecraft lended motivation, but not as much as having knowing what linear equations are. Then the third study was effects of game-based learning on students' mathematics, higher order thinking skills, and meta-analysis. So basically, the last study was about how did it affect motivation. This study was affect how did it affect learning? Did people learn better? So they got down to two studies, found an effect size of 0.263, small effect. Decided two of the studies were outlier, got rid of it, and it cut it in half. So the effect size was 0.13. And then they had a 5 to 3 ratio. So of the 40 studies, 25 found that there was a positive effect on learning, and 3 of them found negative, or sorry, no, 15 of them found negative or no effect on learning. However, this was complicated due to some statistical analysis that I did not understand, don't know the technique, but I trust they did it. They did a trim and fill method to see if there was publication bias. And what that said was there was enough publication bias that there was actually no offense. But then they did another test called the Egger test, um, that didn't find publication bias, so there is a small effect of game-based learning on students' mathematical skills. So a little bit up in the air. But this chart breaks it down really nicely. So you can see things like problem solving helped a lot, math reasoning wasn't helped a lot. You can see Asia, for whatever reason, had a much better scores compared to Europe, where it didn't really help at all. And both of those are decent sized samples. Also that small sample size showed a bigger effect. Who would have thought? Um, so that's a table that kind of breaks down their findings. So the benefits of game-based learning are numerous. Number one, there's novelty. Doing something new is always enjoyable, and just like even if it's a bad idea, doing something new is easier to get students engaged because it's something they haven't done before. Number two is competition. Everyone wants to win. Well, I guess not everyone, but especially with boys. Like we watched that video about boys, and boys in the school system, and boys are more inclined to compete and to want to win. It's easy to measure in the sense that I can give it on a Kahoot. It will like there's a right answer, there's a wrong answer. You can see what it's doing, especially in math. Math is easy to give a question with a right answer and wrong answer, and I can give options and they can see it. And then it's enjoyable. Just playing games is fun. That's why, as we saw, like 97 of the 100 most watched events were sporting events because sports are enjoyable, games are enjoyable. That's what lots of people do in their free time. Challenges are getting the students to buy in. I feel like lots of times students come to class and they have the expectation of what they'll do, and it's somewhat harder to get them like they can be, I just want to do my work and get out of here, and it can be hard to get them to buy in. Another challenge is that the games generally are not on the quality of like Fortnite or Call of Duty. The type of games, video games that they will play in their free time, you're not going to be measured up with the educational video games. As we saw in that first example of the game where you were adding numbers, that game was definitely not on the same graphic quality as these two games. And then thirdly, educational games can just be hard to find and hard to measure how well they are. So you can find something, but maybe it doesn't teach the concepts you want to teach that well, right? And it's really just the game they're playing. Or it can be hard to really find an immersive game. On the other hand, you can add competitive elements fairly easily, right? Like I could just you can just give points for correct answers and then boom, you started gamifying your learning environment. But for in-depth video game like learning, it is somewhat hard to find games and they also are of questionable quality sometimes. So, in conclusion, there are two types. There's immersive games and there's just game-based elements. These games, the main researchers for game theory are John L. Ploss and Bruce Homer, Dr. Bruce Homer, both professors of education in New York. We talked about how it's immersive and you have a game. Within the game, you have problems, but you're really just playing a video game. Or doing things like Pictionary, where you're just adding in to the class, but it's just math problems, not disguising the math problems at all, just doing math problems. The first study was we talked about how students performed better after playing a board game. The second study talked about how motivation increased, and then this third study talked about how learning increased, although it was a little bit suspect based on publication bias potentially. And then we talked about how there's good novelty and it's a good competition way to get people involved and just to have more fun and it's easy to grade, but how it's also hard to compare to actual games and sorry, hard to compare to actual games um, or it doesn't like the quality isn't as good as actual games that students will play, and it can be hard to find and participate in those games. And then here are references for the paper and just some other research on game-based learning in education. And thank you very much.